Okay, welcome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. What I want to do today is read the narrative of the Mekallel in Vayikra. I want to stay up front. I'm going to be reading it against what I think is the standard rabbinic grain, against the way in which you probably were taught it if you went to day school at any point. We're going to be reading it with rabbinic sources, but against the rabbinic grain, right? So I'm not claiming this is the standard rabbinic view. I'm claiming that it's a possible way of reading the text according to rabbinic tradition. So I'm probably going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume or just background without text what I think is the standard reading, and I'm going to try, and I'm only going to provide sources for the non-standard reading I'm arguing for, but I want to pretend that I'm presenting a consensus view. The way we're going to do it is I'm going to read through the text with you first. I've provided with both Hebrew and English, formatted in ways that I hope are helpful, but maybe confusing. So if they're confusing, you can just take out a chumash and read it along with me. And then I'm going to read a number of sources together with you and try and develop them into an integrated reading. So let me start by right. If you have questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself. I'm not sure I can see you raise your hand, so I'm not sure that's going to work. Let's see if I have a capacity. I don't see hands, so I guess just unmute yourself. If there is a hand raising feature that I can see, then try that. And if I haven't called on you in 5 minutes, then obviously it's not working. Let's see, Shoshana, can you try raising your hand and see if that works? Is there a button?
I just raised my hand.
You did. Thank you, Richard. Okay.
I don't know if you can see it or not.
I can see it. So I raise your hand, and if you have a question, and if I haven't called on you in a couple of minutes, and you think that it's not because I'm in flow, then you can unmute yourself because I'm not looking at the screen well enough. But that's basically structure. Read the text together. Note some features about the text, especially about the structure of the text, and then read a series of commentaries together, and hope that out of those commentaries, a convincing possible reading emerges. I have a bias towards this. I have a bias towards this reading because I think that it appeals to me both literarily and morally. So I'm going to be upfront about that also. That I have moral motives for wanting to read the text this way, and we'll see if you agree with me. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen now. Okay, so here we have the story of Mekallel and Vayikra Perek Chaf Daled. So let's start with by saying that it emerges from a halachic text, right? The immediately preceding text is halachic, which is talking about lechem hapanim. Vaytal Aaron al banav, right? It'll be for Aaron and his sons that they'll eat it in a holy place, because it's kodesh kodeshim, who, right? Because it's holy of holies, right? An eternal chok. I'm going to actually put the link in the chat now, so if anybody wants to follow along without my screen, that should be fine as well. Okay. So now everyone's in. So here is the link, I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the link should be in the chat, so you can follow along. And in the original, you'll see there's Hebrew and English. Probably my screen is too small to share everything together. Okay. What I want to get out of this opening, right? That it says is that there's no narrative context for the story of Mekallel, and the halachic context is not obviously relevant. Right? We're not going to the story of the cursor, right? Just if you haven't read the story before, right? It's somebody mysterious. We'll find out who it is who goes out and curses God in some sense. What the word curse may not be the perfect word in the midst of the Israelite camp, and then we have sorry, look. Yes? Okay. Right, and then there's no immediate halachic context. There is a rabbinic context where the rabbis note, right? So the first word of the narrative is vayetze, and he went out. So going out implies that you're in a place first, and the problem is there's no narrative context for where he goes out of. So there's a position of Chazal. I thank my friend Nachman Levine for pointing this out to me, that he says v'yatzame olamo, he goes out of his world, meaning presumably he goes out of his share in the world to come, and that's because the previous word of the halachic section is olam. There's a section that he goes out from making fun of lechem hapanim, which is the immediately halachic section. There are all sorts of connections you can make but they're not in the narrative per se. You have to construct them. So I'm just going to start with just pointing out that a text begins with somebody going out without saying where he went out from. Now, who is he? So he's a Ben Isha Yisraelit. He is the son of a Jewish. I'm going to translate Yisraelit as Jewish for our purposes. Ben Isha Yisraelit, Behu Ben Ish Mitzri. So this is a really interesting way of introducing him. First of all, introduces his mother before his father. Secondly, it introduces his mother, who is Jewish, before his father, who is Egyptian, and it emphasizes it by saying it's not Ben Isha Yisraelit uven Ish Mitzri, not the Ish Mitzri, not the son of a Jewish woman and an Egyptian man, but the son of a Jewish woman, and he is also the son of an Egyptian man. So it's drawing attention to this parentage. What we don't know yet in the narrative is whether he is the only such child of what we could call perhaps somewhat anachronistically an intermarriage, or whether he's just one of a whole set of children of Jews and Egyptians, and also his mother is Jewish, but his father is Egyptian. We don't know whether there are reverse cases, nor do we know if in any sense his father joined the Jewish people. We know nothing, right? Neither his mother nor his father are identified in any way other than by their nation of origin. And then it says, yes.
Did you mention before about Dina L'Europe of Notaris? Because that would
good. I have not mentioned Dina, which is an immediate reasonable parallel, where Chazal have to ask the same kind of question, right? Why does she go out? Where does she go out? I'm not actually going to make much out of the parallel in this year, but you're entirely right. There is such a parallel. Okay, so Vayitzei ben Isha Yisrael ben Ishmash Mitzri Besoch b'nei Yisrael. So he goes out amidst b'nei Yisrael. So we're given not a physical location, but I guess it would say a sociological or an ethnic location. So he goes out amongst b'nei Yisrael, which implies that where he starts is not amongst b'nei Yisrael, and it also seems to suggest that he is not among b'nei Yisrael. And there, the parallel to Dina may be helpful. That she goes out lirot b'bnot haaretz. And the assumption is, at least before she goes out, that she is not among the Benot Haaretz. And so here he goes out B'toch B'nei Yisrael. That might be, and then we could write again if I were teaching Dina, but thank you for the distraction, I guess. We might say that part of Chazal's critique of Dina is that in some sense she wants to be part of Benot Haaretz. So he goes out B'toch B'nei Yisrael. That may suggest that he is seeking to be among Bnei Israel, even though he is not. Okay, Kain is also an interesting example. Yeah, we don't know. Chazal criticized Dina, whether that's fair or not is a fair question. And at the end of this narrative, perhaps you can draw your own conclusions about the parallels. I'm not trying to focus on that in this year. Okay, so he goes out, right? He's this person who has no history other than parentage. The parentage is described unusually. We don't really know what it means. He goes out b'toch b'nei Israel, and then we have another verb, vayinatzu, which seems to mean some kind of physical altercation, probably. Vayinatzu b'machaneh, and they fight in the camp. So we don't know what the relationship between b'machaneh and b'toch b'nei Israel is. Right? If he's already right, why doesn't it say vayinatzu b'toch b'nei Israel? Why doesn't it say vayitzei b'machaneh? So we don't know. Right here, we're described as a physical location, it seems, as opposed to the ethnic sociological connection before. We don't know who this other person is. Right? He goes out vayinatzu b'machaneh. So we would have thought perhaps that vayinatzu b'machaneh is the Bnei Yisrael that he went out among. And then that's disambiguated though, because now we discover that it's vayinatzu b'machaneh ben ha-Yisraelit, the Isha Yisraeli. So this is all really mysterious, right? So ben ha-Yisraelit, the person who went out should be described as more than ben ha-Yisraelit. It should be described as ben ha-Yisraelit the Isha Mitzri. Right? It should be described as right, by both parents. All of a sudden now he's only described by one parent. The one parent has moved from being described as a Jewish woman to the Jewish woman. And all of a sudden we have, and the other character introduced, right, as opposed to the generic B'toch B'nai Yisrael, becomes the Ish HaYisraeli, and the Jewish man. Right. So that's also when you have mysterious. We have somebody alone and then struggling. So we could have thought this is parallel to Yaakov and the angel, but I think probably better to read it that way, that the Ish HaYisraeli becomes the personification of Bnei Yisrael. Right. So Bnei Yisrael are I forget what the term is, right? Represented, synecdoche, whatever it may be, by Isha Yisraeli is a metonymy, right, for the whole Jewish people, and she becomes the Jewish woman, which is an interesting claim. And his father disappears. So why does his father disappear? Okay, then we have a new verb, vayikov, right? So presumably to some degree as a result of the altercation, we're not told who wins. It's just in the process of the altercation, vayikov ben ha'isha ha'yisraelit. So now, right, so we have first isha ha'yisraelit, then ha'yisraelit, now ha'isha ha'yisraelit, the woman, the Jewess, et hashem. So vayikov presumably is some verb that probably relates to a curse which is spelled out, and yet we don't say what the name is. Vayikov et Hashem. So this is a very interesting notion, right? That you curse the name of God as opposed to, or you curse God by name. I think I'll call you in a minute, Mr. Feldman. Thank you. Right, et Hashem vayikallel. So the two verbs, vayikov and vayikallel, and one of the issues that we have to think about, which I won't answer in the course of this year, is the relationship of vayikov and vayikallel. We have to figure out why it says he curses the name without saying the name. So there is the problem always of Yake Yossi. At Yossi, right? How do you run a trial of somebody for cursing or blaspheming God's name? With a great Monty Python skit about this as well. But also right now is the first. This is mentioned by name. There have been no names mentioned so far in this story at all. Right, the guy who goes out is not named. The person he fights with is not named. His parents are not named. And all of a sudden, right now, he curses the name, which we assume means the name of God, Vayikallel, right, or he mentions it, right, something which adds up to cursing God by name, even though God is not mentioned by name. Okay, yes, Mr. Feldman, what did you want to say? Huh? Okay, I guess you can unraise your hand or raise it again later. Okay, Vayaviu Oto El Moshe. So Moshe is Hashem backwards, right? So there's some kind of identification or cross-identification between God and Moshe, and then we get other names. V'Shem Imo, and the name of his mother is Shalomit Bat Divri L'Matei Dan, and they leave him in the Mishmar, which also seems to have, right, Shem and Mishmar seems to be a play on words. Alifrosh Lehem Al Pi Hashem. And now God's name is spelled, right, is at least written out as Yud Kei Vav Kei, even though previously it was just Es Hashem. So why isn't it Vayikov Yud Kei Vav Kei Vayikallel? And that's the end of the narrative that, as it's told, right, the narrative of the curse. Right. So we have a peculiar structure in which first there are no names, then there is a name mentioned only as the name. And then there is the name of his the name of his mother. His father has completely disappeared. They bring him to Moshe to have it explained to them. So always have the issue, right? When do they know how to act? When do they bring him to Moshe? Right? What do they expect to happen? They leave him in the Mishmar, right? This is a story that has also happened with the person they find collecting wood. So we'll have to figure out the relationship between these stories. Why does his mother's name matter? Why are we told her Shevet suddenly? All along she's just been described as Ben HaIsha Yisraelit, Ben HaYisraelit, Ben HaIsha Yisraelit. Now all of a sudden she gets a name. Does it matter which tribe she's from? Right, all those are fair questions we have to ask. Okay, Mr. Feldman, if you're back, what's your question? Okay, we seem to be having back and forth, right? So why does he curse is exactly a great question. We don't know at all. We don't know at all, right? We have no motives here at all. The narrative is wholly mysterious. So you have to figure out what you're supposed to do with narratives that are wholly mysterious. Are we supposed to just say, well, you can't know what's going on unless you have a medrash, or are you supposed to say that there are enough internal clues to figure out, which in essence is you have to go through a process very much like medrash. Okay, so we are now, right? So we have this. We don't know We don't know why his mother matters. We don't know why his mother's name is introduced at the end. We don't know why he curses. We don't right, and it's we don't know the difference between Vayikov and Mekallel. We don't know why it matters who his father is. We don't know why they fight before before he curses. All terribly mysterious. And I'll just tell you up front that none of those questions are answered in the narrative. So we just have to look for clues. There isn't any, right? There's nothing in the text which will tell us explicitly what the relationship is. Okay, so now what they put him in the Mishmar so that it can be explained to them, Al Pi Hashem, what it is that should happen. And God speaks to Moshe, right? We all understand this is the standard halachic introduction. God says to Moshe, quote, "Hotzei et ha-Mekallel el michutz lamachane." So take the one who cursed outside the camp, right? So the fight was in the camp, and the first thing that got right, he's vayetzei betoch bnei Israel, and then they fight in the camp, right? So he goes out, and they end up in the camp, and here the first thing they tell him is hotzei, take him out, and take him out, right? Take him out outside the camp. So he goes out into the camp, and now they take him out of the camp. And everybody who heard him has to put their hands on his head, right, which is generally some kind of notion of expiating sin. So he sort of becomes a sacrifice, it seems. Right, so this is an interesting verb, right? And the whole Eidah. So first of all, the whole Eidah is a whole new group. We haven't heard of an Eidah previously. And Ragam is something you do with stones. So I translated it perhaps tendentiously as the entire assembly must pelt him, right? A pelt is a kind of weak word. But it's not at all clear, right? I want to make clear that it's not at all clear what Viragam means. It doesn't mean the same thing as Visakal. Right? This is something else you do. We don't have to do it with rocks. You could do it at Trogim, famous story in Masechet Sukkah about the Jews being Rogim, the Kohen Gadol, when he does the wrong thing, when he does the Sadducee thing. Okay, and we could just end the story here, right? So so this is what happens, and God tells them what to do, and all is good. But the narrative doesn't end. Right now, God continues talking to Moshe. And he gives Moshe another halachic section, right? It is by V'el b'nei Yisrael to Deber Lemor, which is different by the Deber Hashem Moshe, right? So the first halachic section, right, is just introduced as Hashem spoke to Moshe, although it's obviously right, like not necessarily, but it's Hotzei et ha-Mekallel, right? You, Moshe, specifically, it sounds like, should take the Mekallel. And then other people will do all these things. Now, when do you tell the other people, all the listeners, to put their hand, right? All the people who heard to put their hands on his head? I don't know. Right? God just spoke to Moshe, but now God gives Moshe an additional set of instructions, which, right? And it sounds like what's going on is not a set of instructions related to this case, but it sounds structurally what's going on is this is what to do I just gave you the instructions to do in this case, and now I'm giving you an overall halachic context. What's the overall, right? So speak to all of Bnei Israel, not just to the Shomim. It could be that up till now, the first instructions Moshe gives goes to those who hear, except it says V'ragmu to kol ha'edah. So who are kol ha'edah? So we could say that the edah is just a court. Right, that's on some occasions the word Eidah is just a court. So it could be that there have been nothing relevant to all of Bnei Israel yet, and now we get the instructions that go to all of Bnei Israel. And remember that this narrative begins with him going out betoch Bnei Israel. Every person in Ki Yikallel Elohav or Elokav. It's not clear whether this means God or a Nasi. That's a general debate whenever you have the word Elokim, right? Whether it's Dayan, right? Whether it means some kind of human representatives of God, or just or it means God Himself. In context, it seems to mean God Himself, maybe. V'nasachet, right? So this is a sin that you have to carry. V'nokev shem yud kei vav kei, right? So there's Mekallel that there's Mekallel Elokim, and there's no cave Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now remember, it's Vayikov et Hashem, right? And then later on we say Lifrosh Lahem Al Pi Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? So when he actually does it, God is just described as the name, but then their people bring him to be judged by Yud Kei Vav Kei. Here it says that the one who is no cave, right? The verb Vayikov, right? The verb he does. Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei Mot Yumat. He certainly dies. Rogum Yergemuvo Kol Ha'edah. The whole Edah has to be rogem him. So there are two things here, though, that are different than the instructions previously. Right? The instructions to Moshe said, "V'ragmu oto kol ha'edah." Right? There's only one verb, Reish Gimel Mem. Here, the Reish Gimel Mem is in the infinitive absolute, right, which means that it's repeated, generally understood as for emphasis. It's ragom yergemu vo, as opposed to in the previous section it was v'ragmu oto. Right, so there's a difference in the way the verb read. What the difference is not at all clear, but there is a difference in the way the verb is played. And secondly, it's preceded by mot yumat. He must surely die, and there was no mention of death in the initial instructions. Okay, but so far, right, we have is in some ways seems a direct response to what just happened. The person who went out did two things. He was vayikov and vayikallel. Right, two ways of blaspheming, whatever, doing something to God. The response is we're given halachot, there's yikalel and nokev. It sounds right that nokev is somehow more serious than vayikalel, even though in the narrative it happens the other way around. There's an emphasis on the name that may matter, and we end up that he must surely die with ragom, whereas previously it just said ragom. Okay, now we have something totally apparently gratuitous. Hager ka Izrach, like the stranger, like the alien, like the citizen. V'nakvo shem yumat, when he curses the name, and now we don't have v'nakvo shem yud kei vav kei. It's not when he curses the name of God. It's when he curses the name, just like it's vayikov et Hashem. He shall certainly die. All right, so we have to figure out. For our purposes, I'm not going to be able, I think, to play out well enough when it says Yud Kei Vav Kei and when it doesn't, when it uses the tetragrammaton and when it doesn't. But I'm interested in this emphasis, Kager Ka Ezra, like the stranger, like the alien. Now, why would we have to add that in here? So presumably the answer is that to some extent, the offender in this case is an alien. Right? Whether the word ger means convert specifically becomes a matter of grave halachic controversy. It doesn't matter to us, I think, very here. But we'll treat the word ger as if it means stranger. So it sounds like an assurance that, one way or the other, it could be an assurance that when he's being punished for this is not because he is a ger, but we would treat a citizen the same way. So we're not differentiating between the offender in this case and a standard Jew. Or it could be we're saying that even though he's a stranger, and so he might not understand the seriousness of his offense, he's not cursing his God, right? Because the real begin, ish ki kalel Elohav, right? Then it's just v'nasach oh. So somebody who curses their own God, maybe, only, right, just has to carry their sin, but it's because he cursed our God, the personal Jewish God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, that he has to die. And that happens to the ger like the Ezrach, even though you might think it's not fair to the ger, because our God is not his God, right? You can read it either way. Okay, so we can understand two different ways in which the ger and the Ezrach have to be compared here. Then it says, V'ish ki yakeh kol nefesh adam mot yumat. So a person who strikes any human nefesh certainly has to die. Now, why do we have anything about striking anybody? The only incidents we have of striking anybody so far is perhaps the Yinatsuba Machaneh, the fight in the camp. So why are we suddenly shifting to a death penalty for striking, even if it means striking until death, which doesn't seem to have happened here? But why is it necessary to have this? Now, kol nefesh adam, right? So halachically, kol nefesh adam becomes a whole debate about abortion, perfectly, stillborns, things like that. But in context, kol nefesh adam, any human, right, as opposed to all human nefesh, but any human nefesh, the way I'm translating now, seems like a reference to kager ka Izrach. And it sounds like what we're doing here is creating an equivalence in the fight, which is what the narrative says, it didn't blame one figure over the other. And so now, just like we said, that in terms of cursing God, the punishment is not different one way or the other, because the person is to some extent an alien because his father is a Mitzri. So too, it turns out that the punishment, had the fight become deadly, is no different. And then everything sort of gets messed up, because now we say Makei nefesh beima yishal mena, nefesh tachat nefesh. So this is right. This is a peculiarity. Why are we bringing in nefesh beima? Why is it only compensation? Why does it use the word nefesh? Unfortunately, I don't have good answers for those. Then we go into just wounding, right? We go into what happens if you wound human beings. So you get the equivalent of eye for an eye, but much more played out than eye for an eye. Ending up again, umakei adam yumat. Anybody who strikes a human being will die. And then the closing of this section is mishpat echad yelachem. There should be only one law for you. Hager ke'ezrach yiyeh. The law shall be the same for the ger and the Ezrach, because I am Hashem, your God. So again, we could have, being Hashem, your God, could have made the punishment for Nokev Shem Hashem, for cursing God, different. But because I am Yud Ke Vav Ke, your God, therefore everyone has to be treated alike. Okay, I'm going to finish the narrative now, and then I'm going to take questions for it. Right, so save up. You can save up all the questions you have. We're going to have a 5-minute question break for anyone who has questions after we finish the last section. But I want to thank you, Mr. Feldman, for all the other psukim, which I strongly encourage. Right, look up every other case of Vayikov and Vayisei, and see what you make of them. Obviously I haven't done all of them, and you can pull up your you can come up with different answers to the same questions, really based on them. But I want to finish the pericope, whatever you want to call it, and right. So that'll take another 5 minutes. Then we'll take questions, and then we'll start going through the Makara to build what I hope is a convincing interpretation. All right. So we had
Rabbi Klapper, just a point of order for people. Are you okay with questions continuing to go into the chat in the meantime, or?
Yes, absolutely. I'm reading the chat as we go along. I'm trying to respond.
Perfect. Okay, and then when you do questions afterwards, you can decide if you want people to unmute or you want to keep people in the chat. My recommendation is in the chat, just to make everything easier for you to see and everything, but it's up to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Okay, so far we've had 3 sections. We had the story itself. We had what God says to Moshe about the story. We have what God says to Moshe to say to Bnei Yisrael as what seems like as general rules in reaction to the story. And now it would actually happen. Vaydaber Moshe el Bnei Yisrael. So Moshe speaks to Bnei Yisrael, but we don't know what Moshe says to Bnei Yisrael, right? So this is a very common thing, and we can just say, okay, Moshe speaks to Bnei Yisrael, so he says what God told him to. But which parts of what God told him to? All of it, presumably, I guess. To whom? So we don't know, right? Because we suggested that maybe the beginning of it was an instruction to a narrow subset of Bnei Yisrael, and then there's the instructions to all of Bnei Yisrael. Maybe Moshe says everything to all of Bnei Yisrael, even though he was only supposed to say the first section to a narrow group. I don't know. But we move from Moshe speaks to Bnei Yisrael, and then we have what happened. So that's the first thing that God told Moshe to do, right? If we go back to the instructions, right, God says, right, the first thing God says to Moshe is, take the Mekallel to Michus L'Machaneh. And then he says, right, then God says to Moshe, everybody who heard should put their hands on his head. And then it says, so let's see. The first instruction is carried out perfectly. That's A. It's interesting to describe him as the Mekallel and not whatever the verb form would be of the right cave, right? If the punishment is for what he's done by being no cave, so then why is he described as the Mekallel? There's no v'samchu. We don't hear anything about them putting their hands on his head. Vayirgemu oto oven. So we don't know, right? So it sounds like Bnei Yisrael are gave him, and not Kol Ha'edah, right? So we don't know. It said we didn't have what you rogame him with previously, right? We had right in our instructions of rogames. So in the first one we had We didn't, right? It doesn't say what the consequence is, doesn't say what they're using. In the second set of instructions, it says Rogom Yirgemu Vo Kol Hoida. Right, but it's surrounded by Mot Yumat, so it sounds V'nokev Shem Hashem Mot Yumat. Kager Kozrach B'nakvo Shem Yumat. So we still don't know what you're Rogem with, but it sounds pretty clear that he dies. And then what actually happens, all it says is Vergimu Oto Avin. Right. So the question is, right, what does Avin mean? Avin could mean, that which is what ends up halachically, that they put one really large rock on top of him to crush him. It could be that they, first they push him off a tower and he dies that way, or it could be that Avin is just a means with rocks, or it could be with rock. Okay. Bnei Israel asu asher tzivat Hashem et Moshe, and Bnei Israel did as Hashem had commanded Moshe. So this seems entirely gratuitous. Right, we just saw the instructions, except the instructions, they don't actually, what we see here is that it doesn't sound like the instructions are carried out perfectly at all. So that's a little bit odd. So we could say Bnei Israel asu kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe could be that Bnei Israel did the right? This doesn't relate to the specific thing. It's so first Moshe gives Bnei Israel the specific instructions for this case, and they carry them out, and we just don't get all the instructions about carrying them out. And then Bnei Israel generally do as Hashem commanded Moshe to do, to tell them. And this means that they carry out the general halacha. But when would you carry out the general halacha? Right? When do Bnei Israel carry out this halacha? I guess for all time they carry out the hilchos nazikin. We're not carrying them out now. We have no occasions anywhere else in the desert where this is carried out. So it's a very peculiar phrase. And Bnei Israel did as Hashem had commanded Moshe. And it's also an interesting phrase, right? Kasher tziva Hashem and Moshe. Why does it say Bnei Israel su kasher tziva otam Hashem, the way that God had commanded them, biyad Moshe, via Moshe, instead of saying, right? It said, right? If we read it, Moshe spoke to Bnei Israel, and Bnei Israel did as Hashem had commanded Moshe, which opens the possibility, but not as it opens the possibility of the gap between what God commanded Moshe and what Moshe told Bnei Israel. Okay, that's all the background information of the narrative. So now, just if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions, that's great. Or if you want to ask questions in the chat, that's great. But it's 10:07 on my clock, so I'll wait till at least 10:08 or 10:09 to see if anyone has questions. 10:08, I guess, unless anyone has, if no one stops to ask questions now. Okay, does anyone have questions?
This is Yehudi again. First, I think we have to understand where Vayikol does not mean Mekallel. These are two different things. In other words, Vayikol is to basically nail Hashem's name into the wall, the way you do when you take a census, like Hashem Shemot. That in itself is a capital crime. It's on the equivalent of okay, when you go ahead on top of that and first nail it into the wall, then curse it, that just makes it perfectly clear why you nailed it into the wall. But the first thing itself is a crime, because to just do something like that is a crime. Okay, in other words, there are two crimes here. It's not the thing. That's what I sent you all researchers to prove. Vayikol has to do with specifying or designating something, like so you can specify the names of ordinary people. I gave you a whole list of Shukin and Divrei. I didn't add about them or where that's done, but it's absolutely forbidden to do that to Shem Hashem. And when you do that, that's a criminal act. And that in itself, if you go ahead and on top of that curse and then you just nailed into the wall, then that just doubles it. That's all. It's a double crime. Okay. Okay.
Reasonable.
One crime. They're two crimes.
Reasonable claim. I'm not going to say I think it's necessarily true, but Nokev certainly seems to mean specify out, whether it carries right Moakov lo kabo kel, like by Bilam. Right, it seems to also carry a connotation. That's
exactly the word. No, that's kuf bet. This is nun kuf bet. We've got two different words here. My
Interesting.
echo will cover is cook that. Hey, the other one is nun cook that. But the real point here is that no K basically makes to make a whole. Like you call for without home. Remember the base on
Okay, I understand the argument. Let's take it as a reasonable assertion and see whether it means which way it matters at the end of the year.
Right. In fact, where do you think the word Nekeva comes from?
Yeah, no, I understand perfectly well that no cave can mean to make a whole. I am not convinced that they are wholly distinguishable sharashim, but I haven't done the work well enough to know, and I'm willing to work with it anyway because I think that it will open up possibilities in the context of the shir, and rather than close them. So I'm happy to let you take that as a given.
I also sent you another example of Ragmu Bo. This is not an exclusive here.
That's true.
No,
that's discussed in the Rishonim. Absolutely correct. There is both Ragmu and Vo and Ragmu Et, and all the Rishonim and Achronim all try and decide whether it matters, and if it matters, how. I'm just raising the question. I'm not suggesting that it's an answer or that the answer is only supposed to take place in this case.
What makes you think the Ragam and Tzolkal are two different meanings?
Good question. Let's you're being fair because you're being much more narrowly linguistically focused than I am being in the context of the shir. I would say I'm going to make it as an assumption that different sharashim generally mean different things, and at the end of the shir you'll see how much depends on it, and whether you think it's a reasonable evaluation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, does anyone else have questions? All right, I will thank Mr. Feldman for being the active participant. Wait another 10 seconds, see if anyone else has anything. Okay, if not, then I'll go back to sharing. You can put your questions in the chat or unmute as need be. Okay.
Read your comments.
Pardon?
Read the chat.
Yeah, I'm reading the chat. I'm reading the chat as we go along.
I wrote my questions in there.
Okay, if there were questions, I thought I had responded to them as we went along, but I will go check now. All right, is the story here to emphasize? Yeah, so I think that right. I didn't realize that those were questions as opposed to possibilities. I think all those possibilities are right. I've been trying in the context of the shir just to raise possibilities because I don't want even though I have one suggestion at the end of the shir, the purpose of a shir is not for you to understand the text the way I do, but to open up your possibilities for reading the text. So I hope at the end of the shir you'll have many ways of reading the text that will be different than mine, and in the context of those, you'll figure out which of mine, whether mine is the best way to handle it or not.
I see a parallel with the stick gatherer, where that story is right next to the instructions on how to investigate and how to have adequate witnesses that are unrelated to the issue. And therefore, I'm thinking that this may fall in the same category of that story.
Interesting. It's interesting to put it in the context of procedures. I think I take it as absolutely given that and I think all commentaries say you have to read this story and the story, the two stories really of people being punished in the desert, both together and against each other. You have to both compare and contrast. And it's interesting, you're reading them as compare. They both teach you things about procedure. I might do more contrasting, but I think you're entirely right that those have to be read. And obviously, what I'm setting up in terms of reading a narrative in halachic, the interrelation of narrative and halacha, is something that you have to play out all the way through. Every time a narrative shows up in the middle of a halachic context, you have to try and figure out what the relationship between the narrative and the context is. And you have people who assume that the purpose of narrative is to illustrate law, and then you have Rav Kuperman, Zechron Livracha, the head of Mekallel, who has a beautiful essay that the purpose of narrative is always to contrast with law. Right. So that's a debate in Talmud also, whether the relationship between narrative and law is confirming, right? Is that one confirms the other, one fulfills the other, or that one exists in tension with the other. Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Yoel.
So
yeah.
This could be way off base, but is there any argument that, you kind of alluded to this earlier, could there be an argument that this person was not actually killed, the one who did it? And the purpose and the reason for that would be, I mean, other than the textual issues that you described, which it doesn't say that they actually killed him, could it be that he didn't have fair notice or warning that this was a death penalty offense, and therefore it was handled somewhat differently, perhaps with the samchu, perhaps with the expiation, and also a symbolic stoning, and then but that actually in the end, perhaps I'm really very equivocal about this, but I just wanted to float it as a possibility.
All right, Baruch Shekivanta. So the risk of, right, when you give a shir like this, there's always two ways to do it. You can run it as a suspense shir with a dramatic reveal at the end, right? Or you can try and or you can try and drop breadcrumbs along the way, and right, maybe somebody will figure it out early. And sometimes you write a mystery and you get a problem because you figure it. I will confess having red ink, black heart, and because I know others disagree with me, but I think it's not worth anywhere near worth the length. And part of that was that I figured out what the solution to the mystery was, with hundreds of pages to go. So that was a risk, and you got it. Right, that's exactly what I want to argue. Right, I'm trying to set up right that there's a moral tension all the way through the story in terms of who he is. You were more halachic than I was, but we'll see that your position is anticipated. That maybe, right, the fact that there's a halachic section afterwards, which Moshe has to give instructions, implies that there couldn't have been halachic instructions beforehand, which means that right, in halachic terms, there's no hatra'ah, there was no possibility of advance warning, and therefore there's no possibility of, right, there shouldn't be a possibility of being killed judicially, because judicially we require warning, right? So that's the way to get to that result. I want to argue it not just in terms of judicial procedure, but morally. So a different argument. So what we'll do for the remaining 14 minutes, right, which is great, is to see whether I can construct a narrative out of commentaries that are seen as part of the tradition that makes you feel that was a really compelling reading.
And if I can just sort of very quickly add, Mekoshesh has always bothered me for that reason, that he is killed. But then the understanding of Chazal is that it was clear that he was Chayiv Misa, and the question was what type of Misa was he supposed to get? That's
exactly right. Right, right. So everyone will pick up that, right, that as a different, right, they're both put in the mishmar, but one of them is put to find out how he's going to die, and one of them is put in the mishmar whether he's going to die. Exactly right. Okay, terrific. Right, Shkoyach Gadol. I will be aware if you're in my shir in the future that I have to account for the possibility that the point will be gotten in advance. On the other hand, I guess I did a reasonable job of dropping breadcrumbs then. But I don't think it's. I think that I'm glad of it, and now we can actually evaluate the reading, knowing where I'm going, and let's see. Right, let's see if it plays out. Okay. Okay. So, right, we have all these mysteries about who the person is, why he curses, who his mother is, what's going on in the story. So I'm going to read through a series of commentaries. We have, I think, a total of 7, and let's see if we can build a story again. And I'm playing against very standard rabbinic alternatives. So the Kli Yakar says, the first thing Kli Yakar said I think is very important. He says, since regarding Moshe, it says Vayetze Moshe El Echav. So this is not one of those that was put in the chat, I don't think. So the Kli Yakar draws a literary parallel between what the Mekallel does and what Moshe did, and it says that he does it consciously, right? It's right. Since Moshe, it says Moshe went out to his brothers, I too will go out to blaspheme. Regarding Moshe, it says he turned this way and that, and he saw there was no man and acted in private, but I will go out amidst the children of Israel to act in public. And if we play it out literarily, we'll see that that our halachic narrative says the ish ki Yekallel Okav, but by Moshe it's ki ein ish. Right, there's the parallel Vayetze, and there's Moshe goes out El Echav, and he goes out betoch bnei Yisrael. So I think that we're setting out is not just that it's a very powerful claim, which Chazal of course have too. I just like the way the Kli Yakar sets it up, that this narrative is supposed to be read against Moshe's coming of age narrative, right? Vayetze El is a coming of age narrative. It's a going out. It's a trying to find your identity. And Moshe who is sociologically at that point Egyptian, goes out El Echav and discovers. Now, actually, I think the best way to read the story, which I think Ibn Ezra hints, is that Moshe goes out not yet knowing who his brothers are. And the context of the narrative of Moshe going out and killing somebody, right, being Makeh Adam, Moshe discovers that Bnei Israel are his brothers, although he undiscovers that the next day. And so, right, so you have right here, you have somebody who identifies sociologically as Jewish, but when he goes out of Bnei Israel, he doesn't find his brothers. Right, as opposed to seeing two people fighting and identifying with one of them, right, a Mitzri and a Jew, and he says, I am a Jew. Here, other people identify him, it seems, as a Mitzri, and they fight with him. And so his reaction is the reverse of Moshe. Now, Chazal picked up. I don't think I have this on the Makuritz. I'll just play it out. Right, that the standard narrative Chazal have, which is very powerful in the story, is that Moshe, because when the other Jews who threatened to tattle on Moshe, they say to Moshe, "What have you done?" It says, "Halargenia ta'omer." Do you mean to kill me with speech? Right? Do you say to kill me? And Chazal say that means that Moshe Moshe killed the Egyptian in that story with the Shem HaMeforash. And what they're doing is the same reading. They're reading the story of the Mekallel, who is Nokev Shem Hashem, who mentions God by name explicitly, and they're reading that back into Moshe. And the way they read it is that the Mitzri, whom Moshe kills, is the Mitzri, who is the father of this. So the whole story is read as the inverse of Moshe coming out to his brothers. He comes out, discovers they're not his brothers. Moshe comes out and uses the name of God. He comes out and curses the name of God. And so that tells us why in the end of the story, Vayaviu oto el Moshe. They bring him to Moshe. But bringing him to Moshe is not just because Moshe is the decider of everything. It's because this character is the inverse of Moshe. And he's right, and the Kli Yakar reads it as he is consciously the inverse of Moshe. Okay, right. So he was coming out because he expected to be accepted. Chazal read it much more, concretize that and say he comes out expecting to be given a portion of land amidst Bnei Israel, and they end up saying you have no place in our machaneh, even though you come from a Shevet Dan, and that becomes the whole question of the role of Dan in terms of the Shvatim. You have no place. Now, the Ktav HaKabbalah reads this in a more dramatic way. It says the Isha Yisraeli, who is the Israeli who fights with this man. Ben Bala Dishlomit Meisha Acheret. He is a son of the same mother from a different man. Right? Sorry, the son of his mother's husband from a different woman. The Kevan de Atahahu Mitzra Allah. Because once the Egyptian was intimate with her, so her husband separates from her, and so the husband of his mother finds another Jewish woman and has this child. So now what's going on, according to Ktav HaKabbalah, is that he's not having a fight generally about his place in the Jewish people. The fight he has is with his stepbrother. And he says, look, I am my mother's oldest child, right? So this is sort of an anticipation of Benot Slavcha in a sense, right? So I should inherit I should inherit ahead of you, together with you, and the response the other person says is no, right? You are utterly irrelevant because you're the child, right? You're the child of our mother's adultery with a non-Jew. So a lot of this made it right. Pardon? Yes? Question? Please. Okay. So I see the questions in the chat. So Moshe killed this man's father is exactly correct, and he killed him with the Shem Hashem. Now the question is, what do you do with somebody who killed your father? So part of that is how you view, right? How you view as your as how you view the person who killed your father. So you can do it by you can identify with your mother more strongly, or you can seek revenge, or you can try to identify with your mother and then be rejected. And that'll help us understand perfectly well, right? If he tried to identify with his father and rejected, now we'll understand why he reacts so violently. But how did his mother end up, right, having a relationship with this Egyptian? So the standard rabbinic story is that she's raped, right? That's the whole story is that, right? There are different versions. There are different versions of the story. We'll see some of these versions, right? So Vayikra Rabbah says, there were no Jews in Egypt who were sexually promiscuous. Teidalacha, how do you know this? There was one woman who was promiscuous. And the Torah publicized her. Right? So right, he is the only son in our narrative. The cursor is the son of the only Jewish woman who had relations with Egyptian, and presumably she was voluntary. Right. So that explains why they reject him, because he's the son of a pariah. But the other rabbinic story is one in which she's raped. Right. So we'll have to see, right, how do we view her if she's raped, as opposed to if she is if she's the only promiscuous woman. So the Ziv has a reading as follows. The reason the Torah mentions her by name, right? And we look at it, right? So the story of Vayikra Rabbah is kind of weak, right? So we publicize her name, but we don't mention anything negative about her. Really, we mention her only at the end of the story, not the beginning. It's not so convincing. The Ziv has a different reading. The Torah mentions her by name, which was known in Israel. V'hi shegarma al pi chashivuta, and because she is so significant, right? She's such an important woman. She causes them to bring him to Moshe, v'lasot al pi omek din Torah, and to behave with him according to the depth of din Torah. Aval below zeh, hayush hashomim mitzaklim oto be'eit shmuatam davar mafil kazeh. Otherwise, he would have been stoned immediately, as the next verb said. Right? This is a fascinating claim. It says people would have stoned him immediately. She intervenes and she says, "Bring him to Moshe." Right? She's this powerful woman, and this powerful woman is the reason he is brought to Beit Din, as opposed to being killed immediately. Interesting claim. Okay, the Torah more plays out everything that we have seen previously, right? That the one fighting with him, or the one, right? But I want to make it very, very important in the story. The Torah more says, when it says here they fought in the camp, maybe the other person said to him, "Stop your prattling and go talk and just go play out your father's sins, your father whom Moshe killed b'shem Mefurash." And when he said this, right, that's when the other guy said this to him, that's when this man cursed him, saying, "How could God, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is the name of God, which means mercy, be used to kill my father?" Right, and that's why it says Mekallel Ulai Kishiyada Shemoshehu Oseh Horeg Mekallel Gam Kein Limoshe. Right, and maybe he didn't just curse Moshe, maybe he also cursed God. It says Hashem because Hashem is the inverse of Moshe. He cursed both God and Moshe. And if you look at the narrative, you'll see maybe he cursed God, Moshe, and his mother. Okay, so now let's put all this together into a single narrative. The cool thing about the Storv, the medieval commentary, is that he suggests that the Egyptian did not know that Moshe had killed his father until that moment. Right? The reason he curses God now is because now is the first time that he finds out, right? That he finds out that Moshe killed his father. Right? Let's put all the narratives together. His mother is important. He just finds out who killed his father, but he doesn't know who his father is previously. I don't think. Now it could be that he thinks previously his father is his mother's husband, and he just thinks it was a regular divorce. That's a possibility. But everyone else knows who he is. So what that means is that there's a conspiracy of silence all the way through his life, in which no one knows right? Everyone else knows that he is the son of an Egyptian rapist, but he does not. And nonetheless, we put these readings together, his mother is really important, which suggests that everyone admires the courage of his mother in carrying him to term and not aborting, and in raising him, Now, who would be the person who would most recognize this? The person most recognized this is Moshe, because Moshe understands, right? Moshe is the person who killed his father. So Moshe has been looking out for him all his life. And his mother is recognized as the kind of person who can tell people, stop making fun of my son, and right, or stop, don't threaten to kill my son, bring him to Moshe, because Moshe will understand perfectly well what has happened to him, because Moshe, the day after he comes out and finds the Jewish people as brothers, the next day, the Tana of Iram, if you want, right, whoever the people are in the narrative, threaten Moshe and say, you're not really our brother at all, right? You're like, right, you're the one who's coming to judge us, right, from outside. So Moshe will understand perfectly well what happened, right? Why my son did this. And everyone should understand that my son has lived his life not knowing any of this. And in this moment, when he comes out to claim his patrimony, right, he believes that he is the heir of my husband. And you come and tell, not only is he not the heir of my husband, right, because the younger son breaks the conspiracy of silence and says, what are you talking about? You should inherit with me. Right? Actually, you are not my father's child at all. Of course, he reacts with violence and sudden outbursts. And everyone else says, how shocking. And his mother, who everyone respects, comes and says, you can't do that. Right? You have to bring him to Moshe, because Moshe has responsibility, because Moshe is the one who killed his father. Okay, so what happens as a result of this? The result of this is, so here the Meshech Chachma plays out, right, what Yoel said previously, although he does not, right, he plays out differently than I do, right? He says is, right, it doesn't say by Yomot, it doesn't say he died. Mishum Hashem Yitbarach lo hiskiris lo mot yumad, because God never mentioned that he has to die. And it seems to me, right, that because what Chazal said that by the Makoshesh, the person gathering sticks, Moshe knew that he was right, that he deserved death. But here they didn't know that he deserved death, and his death was without hot'ah, it was without warning, rak horat sha'ah, it was just for the needs of the hours. I want to take all of Meshech Chachma's reading and say, no, actually, Bnei Yisrael realized probably Moshe does not necessarily. Moshe might feel that it would seem like favoritism if he said he doesn't have to die. But everyone realizes, in the context of the story, that what's happening here is that somebody, right, is against everything that God told Moshe, right, that this person is not being treated kager ka'ezrach, and what happened to him is understandable, and therefore I want to suggest the pshat of the story is exactly as Yoel said, that at the end of the story they carry out a symbolic stoning, and actually he survives the story because they realized that what happened, right, everyone was in a sense, I guess, ashamed of how they had treated him. We have to play out why they never told him what had happened, and how that was generally played out in terms of a ger, their understanding of how a ger would be treated in the machaneh. And again, that is my reading. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are questions, I'm happy to stay on, but maybe the chat room is needed. So if you don't have it already, my email is I'm going to put it in the chat right now. My email is Modern Torah Leadership @gmail.com. And also, I will take the moment to advertise my book, Divine Will and Human Experience, which you can find on BookBaby or on Amazon. It's a pleasure learning with you all, and I hope that we'll have occasion to learn together again in the future. Thank you for coming. If there are questions, until they throw me off, I'm happy to answer.
I was wondering how you read the symbol, like the Ida putting their hands on him. Are they like shielding his head in the symbolic stoning in that case, or?
That's really cool. I have a literary feature, which is that it doesn't mention it happening. So I don't know what to make of that absence. Right? Your rereading is clever, but I don't know any place where in Tanakh where v'samchu means anything other than expiation. So I don't have a good, I'm putting out the feature, but I don't have a good answer in any reading as to why the samchu specifically is left out.
Interesting.
Thank you. Okay, other questions or comments? All right then, Rabbi Berman, we'll give you the Zoom. Thank you very much, everyone again. Please be in
Thank-
touch.